right, you Herle Burly-ites, quite a show for you today. We are today 9 days since 25,000 residents and visitors were evacuated from Jasper National Park in just 5 hours. We're 8 years from the devastating Fort McMurray wildfires that forced more than 90,000 people from their homes and cost nearly $9 billion. Many of us are wondering how we and fire should coexist. I'm fortunate today to be joined by two experts. Edward Struzik is a fellow at Queen's Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy in the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University. He's been writing about scientific and environmental issues for more than 30 years. He's the author of 8 books, including Firestorm, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future, and Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire, both written in the aftermath of the Fort McMurray blaze. He's a regular contributor to Yale Environment 360, an international online publication of the Yale School of the Environment. His articles appear in Scientific American, Policy Options, Canadian Geographic, among others. Makes his home in Edmonton, Alberta, 4 hours east of Jasper along Highway 16. Kate Lindsay is the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at the Forest Products Institute of Canada. Kate is a graduate of the University of Victoria and a registered professional biologist. At FPAC, Kate was selected to participate in formal advisory roles to the federal government, including as co-lead of the Species at Risk Advisory Committee and a member of the Pathway to Target 1 National Advisory Panel. FPAC provides a voice for Canada's wood, pulp, paper, and wood-based bioproducts producers, an industry with annual revenues exceeding $73 billion. Canada's forestry product sector is in the unique position to be part of the solution in addressing the impacts of climate change, and we'll talk about that. Ed and Kate, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah. So let's situate this conversation with some basic facts about the forest in Canada. And I'll admit that I don't know anything. Kate, how big are Canada's forests? How would you describe that?
Canada has vast forests. So we have 367 million hectares of forests. And if you look at that at a global perspective, that's 9% of the world's forests are here in Canada. And I can provide some more stats, but essentially that gives you a glance of how significant the forests are in Canada, and really from the very west coast of Canada all the way to the east coast of Canada. And then up against that, where it turns, where it becomes less forested in the north. But really there are forests in all of the provinces, and even starting to, as the climate shifts, more forests are growing actually in parts of the territories as well.
So the boreal forest is expanding because of climate change.
Yeah, well, there are species that are growing faster because of that climatic zone is shifting north with climate change.
And Ed, is there anything about the boreal forest that's unique compared to other forests when it comes to what we're talking about?
Sure. It's born to burn. It can't regenerate unless it has the heat of a fire to open up the spruce cones and to release the seeds. It's just the nature of the beast. It's evolved to learn to live with fire. And what's interesting is Indigenous people really understood this before we came in and told them they couldn't light fires. And there's a wonderful story told to me by a Cree elder when I asked him, because they used fire to burn old forests, to regenerate, to remove that canopy so that grasses would grow for bison and root vegetables would grow. And I said, well, wouldn't you know when to burn? And he said, look at this spruce tree. Its boughs are hanging down to the ground, and it's telling the fire on the ground to come and get me so that I can regenerate. And really, that's just the process that we have. So fire is really a natural part of the landscape in a boreal forest.
Okay, so what's the problem?
Problem is that, in places like Jasper and Banff and other national parks, is that we suppressed fire for nearly a century because we didn't like to have fire. We wanted, those to be pretty forests, with a wonderful canopy, tourists would drive the Icefields Parkway from Jasper to Banff, and they would see all these beautiful pine trees. But at a certain point, the tree gets old and it becomes extremely vulnerable not only to fire but to mountain pine beetles, and it also shades out the bottom of the forest where the root vegetables for not only the indigenous people but for, say, grizzly bears and black bears, and the shoots that you get from aspen, from elk that you get following a fire, that just disappeared. And so when the climate started really heating up in the last 20, 30 years, it just started drying out those forests exponentially, and it just kind of cured them for a fire. And, you just look at the statistics, is that 40% of the big fires in this country are caused by lightning. And there's nothing we can do about lightning, and lightning will increase by 12% with every increase in temperature. So basically, we're looking at a much more explosive situation on the landscape now, and we're dealing, Parks Canada, Jasper has been dealing with that, history of suppressing fires by prescribed burns, but they haven't been able to do it fast enough to catch up with, what's going on with the climate.
Okay, before we get into the particulars of Canada, maybe, Kate, this is not, as I was getting a little ready for this conversation with you, this is not a Canadian phenomenon. I mean, there are fires burning all across Canada right now, but there's also massive out-of-control fires in Western United States, and there's fires burning all across Europe. So has something changed? What has changed?
Yeah, and like Ed mentioned, fire is part of many ecosystems, in particular the boreal, and the boreal spans globally, so into Europe as well. And then in the United States, particularly in Western United States, we're seeing similar ecosystems that would have experienced more frequent low severity burns that would have burned up the fuels and then essentially reset the ecosystem. And I think as society, and Ed absolutely is correct in that Indigenous peoples, the knowledge that is being shared with us is they knew that. They set fires on purpose to reset that landscape, often to bring about new browse for species that were valuable to them. And then, unfortunately, another terrible thing through colonization is stopping that cultural burning. And then I think we had this obsession that we could essentially stop fire, and that concept of Smokey the Bear, of only you can prevent a forest fire, and that was a necessary part of awareness of people not setting fires, but we can't necessarily stop fire. And so, unfortunately,
why not? Globally, can I stop you there? Because that's a kind of a dumb question I have. Like, we're pretty advanced species. We do lots of pretty crazy technological things. Why can't we put out a fire?
Well, what we're learning is that we put out fires very successfully, and that actually created a worse problem for us in that we have very flammable forests now. And because most of the area burned is due to lightning, and we can't control that. And we're seeing weather systems now that we've never seen before. We're seeing drier conditions. We're seeing longer fire seasons. We're seeing these types of cloud systems that a fire will actually create a weather system that will then create more lightning. And it's just this terrible negative feedback loop. And we just can't. We don't have the personnel, the amount of water bombers to put those out. And what we're learning is we shouldn't try to do that. But we should try to limit the severity of fires, and we should try to protect communities, people, critical infrastructure.
Okay. Ed, what was your take going to be on that?
Absolutely right. I would just add that, once a fire reaches a certain size, say, 10, 20,000 hectares, which is fairly common in this square hectares, is fairly common. There's really nothing we can do to put out those fires, no matter how many water bombers you put in the air or people on the ground. All they can really do is slow the fire, maybe move it in another direction. But the reality is that once a fire gets really big and hot on a windy day, it's only going to be Mother Nature, either rain or wetlands that are going to stop it. And the problem with wetlands in this country, which are natural fire barriers, is that we've just been draining them like crazy, and removing them from the landscape. So all of the natural factors that we have, in play, are being overtaken by all the, really crazy weather that we're beginning to see. And the problem is that we've not invested enough in fire science to better understand fire weather. There was the fire that came into Jasper was spawned by a pyro CB, which is a thunderstorm created by the heat of a fire. And it can shoot out lightning. We saw that in Fort McMurray. It shot out lightning 30 kilometers from the fire front and ignited a cluster of fires that far away. And I was talking to some of the people that were working on that fire. They just went, holy shit, where did that come from? And we're seeing more and more of that on the landscape. And once, that fire in Jasper blew 120 kilometer hour winds, driving those flames to town, there's nothing you can do to stop that. You just got to get the water bombers and the helicopters out of the air and the ground crews off the ground, because it's like a hurricane or a tornado. There's nothing you're going to do to be able to stop it.
Well, okay.
David, I think we should, this is all true. Like, we as humans can't stop this, but I think, and I think we'll get into it, but what are the preventative measures that can be taken? Yeah. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
I have some more mundane questions before we get to that. It's a totally side thing, but what is this doing, by the way, to property insurance for people who live in or operate in the forest in Canada?
Well, I was on a Sunday magazine, CBC Sunday magazine, and preceding me was a person from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, I think, and he said, that inevitably this is going to have an impact, and we're seeing this now in places like California, where the insurance companies are not even insuring people who live in areas that are vulnerable to fire. They're just saying no. And other people that can pay are paying an enormous amount, which is leaving a lot of people kind of very vulnerable and not having an insurance. And so just hoping that the government is going to compensate them if they do get burned.
Right. Okay. So the causes of these things, you've mentioned a couple of things, and I just want to get into, because I've heard the following explanations in various locations. I've heard climate change is responsible for these worst fires. I've heard the pine beetle is responsible for these fires. I've heard forestry practices are responsible for these fires, and I've heard that human behavior is responsible for these fires. I want to go through each of them individually, but overall, if the fire problem is worse now than it used to be, and I presume that we are agreeing that it is, the number of hectares seems to rise every year in terms of the amount that's burned. What are the important changes and causes that have created this situation? Ed, you start.
Well, I think, it's a combination of the forest heating up because of climate change, producing more lightning, producing more of the kind of fire weather that acts extremely unpredictably. And the other part of the equation is that we have more and more people moving into these forested landscapes, especially retirees going into the Okanagan, where they think it's paradise. And they get in the way of fire. So we don't have that option of allowing fires to burn themselves out because we've got to protect them. So we're in this vicious cycle of we have so many people on the landscape and so much infrastructure, such as, the oil sands, oil and gas rigs all over the place. We just can't let them burn. And I think this is the challenge that we face. And I think all we have to do is look at Texas, which has had a history of a lot of really big grasslands fire. And they've got a pretty good, strategy that, for example, a Home Depot can't be built on an aquifer there. They've really got, building codes in place to say, okay, we've got to protect what we have here, because we're not going to be able to stop this. So, I really think it's a combination of just more and more people in harm's way and climate change. You can throw in the mountain pine beetle, but the reality is the intensity of a fire in that case is really only when those dead needles are on the tree and then they fall to the ground, and then it does change the hydrology of the area, but I think a little bit too much emphasis has been put on the mountain pine beetle. It's a factor, but it's not as big a factor as climate and people on the ground, and of course people responsible for 50-60% of the fires.
Kate, do you have a different answer than that on what's changed?
Well, when you look at Wildfire 101, there's three main factors that influence wildfire. One is weather, or the climate. One is ignitions, which is what starts it, and it can be human or it can be lightning. And the other is vegetation or fuel. So fire needs something to burn. And, some of the wildfire experts that we've been talking to, it really is this accumulation of fuel. And then you add that with some of these changing weather climate patterns, whether it is, something like the heat dome or these longer, drier periods of time. And that's when trees are more stressed and they don't have the same resilience. And then because we've suppressed fires for about 70 or 80 years, then that is that accumulation of fuel. And so fire has a path to go. But I would agree with Ed that it's our interface. It's humans where we've settled, and that wildland-urban interface is expanding.
So these trees that are old and are essentially fuel for a fire, again, I'm sure this is a dumb question, Kate. Why would we burn them instead of your industry cutting them down?
Well, that is what we think can be part of the solution. Is there are some excellent programs out there called Firesmart in Telefou in Quebec, which is really encouraging communities to understand their risk, or homeowners, and then how can they take preventative action. And the forest industry can be a partner. I think there's a lot of criticism right now that the forest industry wants to be the hero, but really it's just being a key partner in reducing the risk moving forward. And there is an opportunity actually for provinces to tell forest industry, these are the stands that are most at risk. Can we be directed to do our forest harvesting there? Can we utilize a lot of that fiber into products that are good, that are not going to burn, that'll store carbon and actually displace fossil fuel in the course of bioenergy? And then can we pair that with adapted forestry? So what is replanted in those areas is considered, maybe the stalking density is less, or we plant slightly different species that are less flammable, or we leave a fire break around a community. And that's really where the forest industry can be a partner. And because it's going to be costly to do this work, if there can be some cost recovery of these treatments that feed mills, that feed bioenergy facilities, that can be a very positive thing.
The summer of fascinating and very useful tech continues, Herle Burly-ites. This next subject qualifies on both measures. I'm going to do my prairie boy best to talk quantum computing here, both what it can be for Canada and what it means for our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Here we go. Pray for me. Basically, it's computing at warp speed, leveraging the mind-bending principles of quantum physics to solve problems too complex for regular computers, and doing it in a fraction of the time. I'll spare you the deeper stuff about multiple state qubits and parallel calculations. It's so important to Canada and our future that the feds have put a $360 million strategy in place, including $45 million to develop and attract top talent. We're already punching above our weight. Canada is only 0.5% of the global population, but we have 5% of the world's quantum talent. The potential benefits are enormous. Far more complex algorithms and problem-solving capability, vastly improving network traffic and performance. It can analyze huge amounts of data at lightning speeds, giving us deeper insights, improving AI models, and ultimately creating a more personalized customer experience. Far more advanced and secure encryption methods against cyber threats, so your data and information is better protected. It'll even help create efficient supply chains, with predictive models that can forecast demand and manage inventory better than anything we have now. And finally, it puts us in the race for discovery, accelerating research and innovation, leading to new tech and solutions in industries like healthcare, finance, logistics, and telecom. It's a light year of a leap forward. I almost don't have to say it. All that potential computing power requires a network powerful enough to run it on, while upgrading and innovating right alongside it. TELUS is not only a necessary partner to enable quantum computing, now how should I put this? A willing, eager, supercharged partner, working with researchers and experts to help make the network secure and ready for this next evolution. More next week. And I read somewhere that the logging industry actually contributes to this because they don't reforest the same forest that the forest isn't the same after they've been through, and different trees come up that are less resilient to fire.
Well, I guess it depends on the situation, and I think, quite honestly, I think too much has been made of it. The reality is that we do need forest industry in this country. Otherwise, we were not going to be able to rebuild communities like Jasper. Can the forest harvesting practices be improved? I think so. I think one of the important things that I might add is that, we have to look at it holistically. If we do send in the forest industry to clear cut an area that is extremely vulnerable, we have to take into account something that I think is not part of the strategy right now, is that the importance of wildlife habitat in these environments, such as woodland caribou, that tends to be overlooked. And I think that, if we're going to have a national forest fire strategy, which I've been advocating and others have as well, is it's got to involve the forest industry. It's got to involve biologists who understand the relationship between, especially endangered species and forests. So it's got to kind of be a holistic effort. It just can't be, say, okay, this area is vulnerable, let's cut it down, without really looking at what it does in the broader sense. So I think that's why we need to have kind of all hands on deck, with the federal, provincial, federal government working with the forest industry, working with businesses and Indigenous communities to come up with a plan to figure out how can we tackle this in the best way possible.
Kate, what do you have to say about the industry in terms of what it leaves behind?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting conversation right now. Talking to a couple of wildland fire experts recently, Dr. Laurie Daniels and an individual named Bob Gray in BC. Industry actually used to do something called broadcast burn or back burns. So after we would harvest an area, we would burn, so a prescribed burn, to burn up some of the fine fuels that aren't considered merchantable or go into a product. And that actually helped limit the surface fuels. And then we would go in and replant after. And that provided a level of kind of wildfire prevention for a period of time. But the public, and this was in the 80s and 90s, didn't like the smoke. And after these broadcast burns, and so really it stopped being practiced. Because again, we practice forestry on public land in Canada. 90% of the area where we practice forestry is owned by the province or territory. And so the public has a say. And so they didn't like the smoke from this. But what I think, if you revisited that now to say, we don't like evacuations, we don't like towns being destroyed, and we don't like this catastrophic fire and smoke in the air, maybe going back to a level of prescribed burning actually is a role that we could play. And then there's, people saying, well, maybe we also need to retrain those that can do prescribed burning. And we hear Indigenous communities saying we would like to reintroduce cultural burning as well, but we know that forests are too flammable or overstocked. So there's a role of thinning a forest and then adding a level of treatment, prescribed burning, cultural burning, that I think could help reset forests so they're less flammable moving forward. And that's a role industry can play in a partnership role.
So did we get away from burning these old trees out of aesthetics?
Yep.
Is that what it is?
That was a big part of it. Is that if you read, the first annual report by the superintendent of what is now Banff National Park, he kicked Indigenous people out of Banff because they lit fires, and he said, that it really just changed the aesthetic. And he actually wasn't really very happy with the boreal, and alpine forest that was there. He was, looking at bringing other, more pretty trees in from other parts of the world, like Central Park did. That was the phenomenon there, is that Central Park was really just a kind of a boreal bog at one time. And, and then they just basically drained the bejesus out of it, took out all of the spruce, all of the pines, and then they brought in trees from all over the world. And so that's really how it evolved. And then when Parks Canada in 1988, when Yellowstone burned so big, it was international news. It really scared everybody in Parks Canada, and it was Nick Laboucan, who was the fire specialist for Parks Canada. He told Cliff White from Banff, we've got to get on top of this, because if it happens to Yellowstone, what's it going to do to Banff? And so they started this, prescribed burning, not thinning in the beginning, but there was a lot of pushback from the public. Tourists coming in the town, we don't like smoke. I mean, we didn't come here to, breathe in smoke. And the business community pushed back, and everybody just decided, okay, we've got to really slow this down. And so that was really a problem. And I can remember Cliff White taking me up to Sulphur Mountain, where the gondola goes up to Banff, mountaintop up there, just after the Fort McMurray fire. And what he really wanted to do was to burn that 80-year-old stand of pine and spruce that goes to the top. And he just said, that one of these days we're going to have a lightning strike, or there's going to be some illegal campers start a fire. And what does a fire do when it starts? It goes up, it races up. And if you have hundreds of, Japanese tourists, in high heels and sleeveless shirts on top, there's no way you're going to get them all down in a gondola.
Right. Well, okay. So we've been skirting around the causes of these things, and you people have been mentioning, both of you, lightning. I saw I'll be honest, I hear people say that humans are the cause of these things, and I was kind of dismissive of that, leaning more just intuitively toward the climate change explanation. But I think it's the head of fire, for California, who said 95% of fires are human set.
Yeah, that's because California is really a unique situation. I mean, it is absolutely true. Most of the fires in California are started by people. In fact, the Park Fire, which is burning now, was started by a guy that drove his mother's burning car over a cliff and started it. And that is just so common. When the governor's office called me down in 2018, where they basically just decided, okay, this thing is out of control. And they brought in people from all over the world in Sacramento and just, said, kind of like, all right, what can we do? And, a lot of us, sat there and thought, well, geez, what works in the rest of the world, is not going to work here, because you just got too many nut bars out there purposely starting fires. And, some of them, former U.S. Forest Service firefighters that have done it in Colorado. And you think, okay, well, there are special circumstances. Fortunately, we have a more civil society in Canada, and I think, I always use the classic example of what happened at Fort McMurray. In reality, if that had been any place else, we would have had a whole bunch of crispy critters left behind, including humans. And the reason why those people got out successfully is because they all work for the oil sands industry, and they are trained, to evacuate on a moment's notice. And the mantra is you do what you are told, no questions asked. So when the RCMP officers, were blocking roads going into schools and neighborhoods that were burning, and these big burly oil fields guys were coming up in their F-150s, and telling the RCMP officer, I'm going in there. He said, no, you're not. You will deal with it. And they all obeyed. And the other thing about Fort McMurray is nobody goes there to retire. So they were all a fairly young, mobile population. Could you imagine if it was, Elliott Lake or someplace where you've got all of these people, on driving around on these
walkers,
wheelchairs?
Yeah.
And I think the stats, David, from Canadian Forest Service is, I think it's about 57% of fires in Canada are lightning caused, but that means that there's just under half are human caused. I did see an analysis at one point of accidental versus. So I think it's rare there, but there was an incident last year in Quebec.
I wasn't alleging arson, because what I was reading was it can be like somebody drove on a flat tire and the sparks from the wheel caused
exactly. Yeah.
So that's a pretty flammable fucking situation. If you're on a highway and the sparks from your wheel interacting with the road are going to cause a massive forest fire.
Well, that's probably what happened in Fort McMurray. It was an all-terrain vehicle with an extremely hot muffler, just was driving over, kinder-dry twigs, left behind a little bit of a spark, and it wasn't noticed until that big plume of smoke came up. And so these are the things that I think are avoidable. We can equip these vehicles with what's needed to prevent fires. But I think this is the learning curve that we need to take, and a little bit more aggressively, is to reduce the human caused fires that we have on the landscape. But lightning, causes those big fires tend to be ones that are caused by lightning in areas where you don't have a lot of people.
Okay,
that's usually so. If 57% are caused by lightning, I think it's over 90% of the area burned is the lightning caused fires, and that's largely because those are areas where it's harder to get to put them out, or in some cases, provinces may choose not to put them out because they want to let those fires run their course. So,
right. Hey, remember Grand Funk Railroad? Homer Simpson's favorite garage rock guys? We're an American band. No? Well, they were a thing in, say, the early 70s. Anyway, I thought of them because I was reading a little railway history. 172 years ago, the government decided it wanted a railroad between Montreal and Toronto. It was called Grand Trunk Railway, and it was the most important early building block of our sponsor, CN. Grand Trunk quickly absorbed a bunch of smaller railways, and by 1867, the year Canada came into existence, it was the biggest railway in the world, 1,300 miles, running through the Maritimes, Quebec, and southern Ontario. Its main business was moving grain from the prairies to markets and ports in eastern Canada. That mission hasn't changed much. In any case, by the dawn of the 20th century, the big national goal was a transcontinental railway. It was a mammoth and blindingly expensive dream, but absolutely vital to the economy. So Grand Trunk made a deal. It would lay down tracks from Winnipeg to Prince Rupert in BC, and Ottawa would build from Winnipeg east to Quebec City and Moncton. By 1914, Grand Trunk Pacific was ready for operation. The National Transcontinental was completed a year later. But the actual cost of building it came in way above estimates, leaving Grand Trunk wallowing in debt. And of course, by then, the Great War had begun, which dried up capital. Grand Trunk went bankrupt. The Fed stepped in. And on June 6th, 1919, Canadian National Railways was born. I guess you'd call that a foundational Canadian story, because it is. It's part of how our country was built. Climate's not going to get any better in our lifetime. Climate change is going to continue to occur. So how is this going to progress? What changes are we going to see yet in the forest over the next 20, 30 years as GHG emissions continue to rise and the heat continues to rise? What changes are we likely to see, and how will that impact these fires? Okay.
Well, look at it was stated earlier is that, in some parts of the country, the forest is actually growing. There's more vegetation because vegetation loves heat. But the other scary part of it is that, a 1% increase in temperature equals 12% increase in lightning. And if you have 3 degree increase, you probably have about a 36%. And we're also now starting to see these lightning storms, migrate north into the Arctic. And, I was in Greenland in 2018 when they were evacuating people from the tundra on Greenland because of a lightning strike that lit up the really dry tundra. And we're starting to see lightning in parts of the Arctic that we rarely see it before. So I think lightning is really going to be one of the features of climate change that is really worrisome. And the other part of it is that we're going to have more of these heat domes that are going to produce these 30 degree plus temperatures that we had for a week,
dome?
10 days.
What's a heat dome?
You remember the heat? They used
you
to call
guys
it the
keep
heat
inventing
wave.
new terms. I first
I
noticed this with tsunami 20 years ago. What's wrong with tidal wave?
Laughed at it.
Anyway,
it's a heat wave. But it actually is a good technical term because one of the reasons why you can call it a heat dome now instead of a wave is that it's no longer wavy, is that, our weather is controlled basically by the temperature differences between the Arctic and the South. And when those temperatures differences are great, the weather moves more quickly from west to east, which is the traditional pattern. But when the temperatures are closer together, it just does not have the strength to move that weather. And so it's creating this phenomena now that they're calling domes, where we just don't have that the natural phenomena to drag weather from west to east. And so, you can see it in really hot sunny days, but we're also seeing it, on rainy days, as we've seen in British Columbia with all the flooding, where, the low pressure system comes in, instead of sort of moving, it just hangs in there and just starts dropping a ton of rain in one place.
Right.
And I would add, David, like I'm from Vancouver Island, actually, and which is probably an area, like we talk about the boreal experiences fires, roughly every 80 years. There's a stand replacing fire in the boreal, and there are tree species that are adapted to that. We're seeing in parts of the boreal right now that now they're down to 45, 50 years. We're seeing fires moving through these landscapes. So this is more frequent than we're used to. And then in places like where I'm from on Vancouver Island, we have longer periods between fire, kind of 200 years, 300 years. Although it happens, like on East Coast Vancouver Island in the 40s, most of the East Coast of Vancouver Island burned, but people don't remember that. It's kind of beyond human memory. And then when I was there, actually after the heat dome effect, I saw parts of where I'm from die off in these areas, actually in a protected area. I saw die off of trees. So they're experiencing heat and drought that are uncharacteristic of those ecosystems, and those species are not adapted for that change in temperature or that prolonged period of heat. And so I think we are going to see, we're kind of locked in to the near-term future of more fires, more intense fires, and unfortunately, increased costs associated with trying to fight those fires. So, and that's a scenario that we're kind of locked into until we see, an ability to bring down the rise in temperature and impacts of climate change.
Kate, can I stick with you for a minute? Because on climate, it's a different issue slightly, but I feel it's probably related, and maybe you can tell me how it's related. That our forests and the forests across the world were big elements of the fight against climate change because trees are carbon sinks. Forests are carbon sinks, right? So they absorb the carbon from the air themselves. They're like carbon capture and storage that actually works. So what is the impact of these fires on that?
Yeah, it's huge. And so forests can be carbon sinks.
Okay.
But to be honest, so they sequester carbon. That's actually the process of absorbing CO2 out of the air and producing oxygen. And then they store that carbon in the tree, in the fiber, in the branches, in the roots and soil. And so it's a fairly natural cycle. It's called the biogenic carbon cycle. And so they absorb the carbon out of the atmosphere. And then at the end of that tree's life, it succumbs to a mountain pine beetle or pest, a fire, or it falls over and dies and decomposes. That CO2 and other greenhouse gases are emitted back into the atmosphere. But what we're seeing now, particularly in Canada's forests, is they're no longer providing a sink because of them, the fire suppression, because they're aging, because we see the impacts of pest outbreaks and fire, that the balance has been crossed. So they were a sink, and now they're more of a source of GHG emissions. And so we do need to get our forests, our collective forests, back to being a sink so they can be part of the fight against climate change. But that probably means we're going to have to increase the resilience of our forests, which means a level of intervention. And then the other, I think role.
When did that happen, Kate? When did that must be fairly recent, because I remember, I'm an old man, but nonetheless, I remember that Canada used to claim that these things should count against our international GHG reduction targets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's pretty recent. Like even during the Kyoto negotiations, there was some assessment that Canada had an aging forest. And so the sink wouldn't last forever. Whereas a country like the US had a younger forest. And so it would still count or be part of the sink solution for a longer time. But what we're finding is, we can't make that assumption anymore. But one thing that we can do is if we utilize forests, if we transfer the carbon from the tree into a long-lived wood product, so lumber that goes into housing, a big beam that goes into a beautiful building, that is going to store that carbon for the life of that product. And then we regenerate those stands, ideally with kind of adapted forests or climate smart forestry. We actually have the opportunity to overall have a benefit from a carbon perspective, but I think we're in a challenging situation based on the current health of Canada's forests, and particularly in those old forests. And Parks Canada did their own report to say, right now, forests in parks and protected areas have also switched, so they're no longer a sink, and they're contributing as a source now.
Great. You're just a font of good news.
Sorry.
Yeah, you really are. Ed, I want to come back to something you said about this bloody beetle. I mean, I've been hearing about insects and trees my whole life. First got involved in the Young Liberals. I met a guy from New Brunswick who was talking to me about the spruce budworm that was destroying forests in New Brunswick in early 1980s. So it's been around for a long time, this issue. You say it's not that big a thing, but some of the reports I've read about Jasper talk about, experts that were flying over top the last few years, and we're seeing the growing impact of the pine beetle, and we're telling governments this thing's going to burn. because of the beetle.
I got to qualify my earlier remark. It is not as big a factor in the fire regime as some people say. It still is, and the reality is that I was on the first survey, one of the first surveys in Jasper National Park with Dave Smith in 2011, where he was really worried about mountain pine beetle coming into, and we did a helicopter survey and found about 400 trees that had been infected. Today, there are 263,000 hectares that are affected by it. Now, go back to what Michelle said, is that, they're no longer, they've changed the hydrology of the region. For a time, they were, they could intensify the nature of fire with the red needles, and that are dead on the tree. It would be much better from, a carbon capture, from a hydrological and wildlife health, if we had a stand of younger aspen and poplar growing first, and then spruce and pine taking over, which is more the natural regime in those ecosystems. But then again, qualifying that is that, my good friend Ian McLaren, an historian of Jasper, points out that most, at the turn of the century, a good part of Jasper was savanna. It wasn't forest, and it was because of fire suppression that we have this forest that we have in most parts of the park. So, we have, it is kind of a cultural wilderness, as I think is the name of his book, is that we've cultivated this forest ecosystem. It's not the ecosystem that it was there before. And now this new player that's come in, the mountain pine beetle, has really upended things in a big way. And I know that some of the hotels in Jasper were really affected by the fact that they had a lot of dead trees on their property. And, if there had been aspen and poplar, or if they'd been cleared out, it may have not caused as much damage. I don't know, but the reality is that we've got an unnatural forest regime at play in Jasper, and places like the Keno fire in Waterton. They avoided a fire for nearly a century, and that fire ripped through 80% of the park in 8 hours in 2017, I think.
And just to close off on this beetle, we don't have anything to do about this other than to drop something that's the equivalent of Agent Orange from planes flying overhead?
That's not going to work.
Right. Is that all we know how to do, though? Is that there's no other way to fight this thing?
If I might add, so Alberta actually implemented what's called a healthy pine strategy. So mountain pine beetle, it's a native forest pest. It's been kind of on these annual cycles of chewing up forests. I think because of warmer winters, we didn't kind of die. The larvae themselves didn't die back. I'm not an entomologist, but so it kind of got out of control because of fire suppression. There was a lot of old, even age stands, pine stands that it could chew through, and then when it walked into Jasper, it had lots of food, but it came from British Columbia. Saskatchewan was worried that it was going to move across. And so I think they actually helped support Alberta's healthy pine strategy. And that's where Alberta government used the forest industry.
Most things moved from Saskatchewan to Alberta, not the reverse.
Yeah, well, I think Saskatchewan was happy in this case that Alberta stepped up efforts. And that's where forest industry was directed to harvest older pine stands to help get ahead of it. So basically to remove the food source of this beetle. So I think there are strategies that we can use. And we know that there's other native forest pests like bark beetles and spruce bedworm. And then there are invasive that are coming in as well. So anyway, there are strategies we can use, but in this case, mountain pine beetle, I think it was the added effects of climate change that we a lot of scientists didn't understand how severe and how much it could move. So
interesting. Okay, so let's get into what's next. I'm going to start with, it's so typical of Canada that this fire in Jasper happened, a national tragedy, and it immediately devolves into a jurisdictional dispute, right? About who's responsible for what and who's to blame for what and all this kind of stuff. So can you sort this out for me? Maybe start with you, Ed. Between the various levels of government and the industry, who's responsible for what with our forests?
Well, this is a hornet's nest, and I'll start off with the criticisms of what happened in Jasper, that it could have been done differently. But I'll go back to this idea is that, Jasper has been preparing for a wildfire for 20, 30 years. It's done more than any other jurisdiction to deal with a fire. So if a fire can come into Jasper, which has been preparing for it, fire smarting, thinning, burning, then what does it say for the rest of the country, and especially in the provinces like Alberta, which, have been slow in trying to mitigate, or prevent, more fire from coming into towns. Pointing fingers is not going to be helpful. That's sort of, as you pointed out, it's the mantra. We argue over everything, but I think we should be able to agree at this point that, all right, let's not call this climate change. Let's just agree that fires are burning bigger, hotter, faster, more often, and unpredictably, and it's very likely to get worse. All we have to see is look at the trajectory since 2003, when Parks Canada was overwhelmed with fires in Jasper, Banff, and Kootenay, and other parks in the country. And ever since then, we've had, Okanagan was evacuated that year, 45,000 people. Then we had Slave Lake evacuated, Fort McMurray. We had Waterton burn. We had, Nova Scotia last summer burn. I mean, it's just pretty obvious to everybody that this is a freight train that's picking up speed, and it's going to start going downhill instead of uphill. And we have just got to do what, former Manitoba Premier Gary Filmon recommended following the 2003 fires in the Okanagan, when he was appointed by Liberal Premier Gordon Campbell, getting one guy from one party to another guy from another party to come in and say, okay, let's do an inquiry. What do we need to do? And he basically suggested we need to have a national wildfire strategy. And it's been reiterated, that recommendation, over and over and over again. I presented to the Canadian Council of Forest Minister. They invited me to speak in, I think, 2020. And I made the case. And I understand that when they just met in Abbotsford, they agreed that they were going to look at it. But, looking at it is in my mind, a graveyard for ideas. Especially when it comes to federal, provincial, looking at something would take forever. I think what we really need is something at the higher levels to essentially say, okay, let's compare this to the Apollo mission, where the space capsule is running out of oxygen, and those on board really just don't have the answers to be able to deal with the situation. And Houston comes to everybody in NASA and just said, I don't care how crazy the idea is. I just want to, everybody, put your heads together, come up with something. And, the good news story is they solved the problem. But it was only because they really just decided they needed to act really quickly, and they just entertained every possible idea. And I think we do have the expertise, and we can bring people from outside of the country to come and tell us what do we need to do, and we have to set aside our differences between the feds and the provinces, because it's getting really tiresome.
Okay. Kate, Ed talked about all that Jasper had done to get ready for this. But the Alberta government really seems to me to want to blame Parks Canada for this fire, for not doing a lot of things you've talked about, for not clearing out that dead wood, for not removing all that fuel. Is that a fair comment?
I think it's really challenging. And it's this weird overlapping jurisdiction where you have a municipality within a national park, and Canada has jurisdiction over the park. Alberta has a level of jurisdiction over the municipality and the surrounding area. But I don't think finger pointing is necessarily going to help. But I think it is, what do we do now going forward, knowing
that's
what
a dodge, That's what's known in politics as a dodge, right?
It is. And I mean, I've been listening.
I don't have to answer that because it's not the central point, right? Answer it. Did they fuck it up? Did Parks Canada fuck this up?
Well, I think the sentiment is too little too late, right? Like they took action, but it was not at the level of at scale that was necessary for the challenge. But I agree with Ed. We even actually a forestry company was brought in to help do thinning 3 years ago, but could more have been done? There was a reliance on prescribed burning. It's difficult to find the window of opportunity to do a prescribed burn, and so relying on prescribed burning is probably not the best way forward. But I think there's a fundamental kind of issue at stake, which is, we create protected areas so that essentially becomes a static reserve, and yet we have dynamic ecosystems that undergo change and need to undergo change. And so there is a difference of philosophy, I think, in some of the parks and protected areas, divisions of governments, that we need to maintain. It's like almost putting a glass dome over an area to preserve that nature. But Mother Nature, it just doesn't work that way anymore. And so knowing what we know about the level of fuels in those areas, the increase effects of climate change, we need to revisit that objective of ecological integrity. And instead of a hands-off approach, we need a hands-on approach. And I think that's going to take time for an organization like Parks Canada. But I think they're starting, and I think Jasper was probably ahead more so than some of the other parks in Canada. But I think that moving forward, that has to be part of the management plan, is adding a fire lens or an extreme weather lens. We can't have a hands-off approach anymore.
So the way you're describing this to me, I'm actually getting really confused as this conversation goes on, because you're describing to me a situation where pretty much the problem was identified and well understood, and the ways to deal with it were identified and well understood. So it's not like we're dealing with a phenomenon we don't understand or that we don't have any idea what to do about it. So why weren't these things done? Is it because, as I said earlier, we're trying to aesthetically preserve Banff, Jasper, all these different things? Is it because we don't want to spend the money on it? Is it because it's confusing as to whose job it is? Like, if we know what was to be, if we knew what the vulnerability was, and if we knew what should have been done, why weren't those things done, Ed?
Well, I mean, several fire managers have told me over the years is that politicians are really happy to sign big checks to people who, are displaced or affected by catastrophes, but they're not so willing to sign those big checks to prevent and mitigate those catastrophes from happening. And I'll give you an example. When I was with the Council of Forest Ministers, I think in Manitoba in 2020, I think it was one of the federal ministers was going around handing out checks to people to get out of floodplains. Because there are just so many floodplains in Winnipeg, every year flooding. And we all knew what needed to be done, is that the Red River is going to flood every year. There's nothing we can do about it. So they finally just decided we're going to, create a big pot of money, tell everybody, here you go. We're going to give you value-added check to move you someplace else. Now, I'm not saying that we should move people out of the boreal forest, but that's unrealistic. But I think that we do need to have, a national strategy to empower, say, all of those boreal communities in Canada, that don't have the resources that Jasper had, the expertise that Jasper had.
Well, I've read your stuff. I mean, you make the point. I mean, this stuff comes to people's attention across the country and the world when it hits a place like Jasper or when it burns Lytton to the ground. But most of the time, the people that are affected are Indigenous people, right? And nobody ever hears about that.
That's right. Indigenous people represent 5% of the population, but 42% of the evacuations in this country. And really, our answer to that is that, we'll just fly a bunch of planes and then we'll put you in a cheap hotel for the summer. Fort Good Hope just burned in the Northwest Territories. That's what happened. My daughter was in Norman Wells when they were evacuated, and she was making Spam sandwiches for them because that was all that was available in Norman Wells. White bread and Spam sandwiches for 3 weeks.
Sounds like childhood to me, but let's leave that aside.
Yeah, right. This is not the answer to deal with, fire. Is just to simply, put everybody on a plane. Yellowknife was evacuated last year. I had friends here staying with me. It's a big convoy of people. They're out of their homes for the rest of the summer. This just can't continue. I mean, we really have to kind of wrestle with this, and it's only going to happen with a national strategy that, like I say, it's got to be the federal and provincial governments getting together with Indigenous communities, with the forest industry. And as you say, we know most of what needs to be done. I mean, it's pretty obvious in a lot of cases, but there's also a lot of other things that we don't understand. Is we're not that good at predicting where fires are going to burn. We don't understand fire weather as well as we should. So we should be investing more in fire science, and we can't do that if the Alberta government is ratcheting a 45 or 25% budget cut at the University of Alberta. Which used to be the best wildfire science university in the country, and you just can't grow knowledge in that kind of environment.
Right. Kate, I presume nobody knows the forests better than the companies that are members of FPAC. What's the role for industry moving forward in dealing with fires?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say three main contributions of the forest industry. One, I think, is knowledge, and increasingly forest managers are working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples, and so kind of a braiding of Western science and Indigenous knowledge in the management or stewardship of large landscapes, and that is a role that professional foresters and ecologists can play. Second is that we can be an end user of that fiber. We know that there's going to be, as we target stands that are most at risk around communities, we know that there's going to be different types of fiber coming out of the forest, some of which obviously we can use in conventional products, but some of which it will have to feed bioenergy facilities or these types of things. And then third is really a boots on the ground workforce. Like, you're right, these foresters and these companies have long-term relationships. And I think there needs to be a level of trust that is built on a kind of whole of society approach, or all hands on deck. But really, it's a significant workforce in many communities, hundreds of communities across Canada, obviously, that are within the forest or adjacent to the forest. And really, it's a strong workforce that can be put to good use and really has knowledge to bring to the conversation. So can I just add, David, just on the question you asked, Ed, about what can we do? Because I've been thinking about this for a long time. There is a pretty good roadmap for implementing the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy that Canadian Council of Forest Ministers just put in place and endorsed. There's Fire Smart program, which is a good program for homeowners and communities to walk them through the steps of preventing or mitigating risk. And then there's these concepts of kind of implementing at these three levels: homeowner, community, and landscape scale. And they all have to work together. We see, Lytton burned down because it caught fire, same with Jasper, from the surrounding area. So all of those need to be working together. And I think provinces understand, but there's still silos between wildfire prevention branches, forest management branches, emergency services within provinces. And then we haven't seen, I think, the daring leadership of the federal government in the US. The United States government put forward the wildfire crisis strategy. It actually mapped at-risk fire sheds, they call them, so areas that are most at risk, and then put in place targets for treating vegetation. We know the fuel, we can map the fuel, and we can treat the fuel. We can't always predict where the fire will start, but we can at least take action and set targets to to remove vegetation and treat those areas. And it's costly, and it means putting budget and putting money into preventative actions rather than reaction.
But this is where climate change is starting to cost us money, right? This is an example of where it's starting to cost us money. It has an economic consequence to it.
It exceeds $1 billion each year to fight wildfires.
So Ed, is what Kate laid out, is that the national strategy that you are looking for, or do you have some specific, especially for this call, most of the people are involved in federal politics to listen to this show. What are you specifically looking for from the federal government on wildfire strategy?
Well, I think everything that was outlined there, I think is got to be part of it. I think we have to find better, more effective ways of empowering those homeowners, those communities without the tax base to be able to, bring in the expertise and do what is necessary. So that should be part of the, a federal provincial program. And I think it's got to be federal provincial program. Otherwise, the provinces are going to say, well, you guys, we're not going to listen to what you're going to do. But I also think, it's got to be much more investment in understanding, if we're going to, identify those areas that are extremely vulnerable to fire, we got to have the experts to be able to map that out. And I'm afraid we don't have, the Canadian Forest Service had, employed, I think, 2,200 people in the 1990s. And then you remember the big budget crisis under Paul Martin, where we're
I may have heard of that. I've heard
almost bankrupt, and it was 15-20% cut across the board. Well, the Forest Service got hit the hardest. I mean, they almost disappeared, and now they went from 2,200 to about 700 people, and there's only about a dozen fire experts within the Forest Service. It's growing, and they're going yippee, but that's the kind of Canadian response to a few little grains thrown their way. We really need to have something much bigger in place. We need to start funding the universities more to create that expertise to be able to tell us, what are we going to do? How are we going to be able to tackle this? And I'm afraid that we just don't have the expertise that the U.S. has, and that Australia has, because they've just been hit so hard, since 2003, and they've realized that it just can't go on.
Well, the temperatures they hit there are astonishing. So.
Sure. But, look at Alberta this week, or the past week before Jasper. I mean, we were having 7-10 days straight of plus 35-degree weather. I mean, that was crazy. And, as Mike Flanagan, I think, pointed out, the great fire expert that used to be at the University of Alberta and got recruited to go to UBC after all the budget cuts, said there's a good fire, but there's no good smoke. And so with prescribed burns, we got to, you got to figure out a way is that, okay, if we're going to burn and we're going to send smoke into areas where people have to breathe, we're going to have to, find ways of making homes more resilient and communities more resilient to smoke. And there's many ways of doing it, but we're not even thinking about it.
One of the problems in politics would be that many of the things that the two of you are proposing are going to seem to ordinary people either kind of counterintuitive or maybe even beside the point. I mean, as I watch social media, most people are saying, why the fuck don't we have more water bombers? Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I was asked that question actually from somebody from Audubon in the United States after I wrote my last book, asked me, well, how many, because they're really very concerned about the boreal forest because, it's one of the great nesting areas for songbirds. And they said, how many water bombers would we need and how many people on the ground would we need to be able to just, deal with this? And, my answer to that is that no amount of water bombers and no amount of people are going to be on the ground are going to be able to contain, what we're seeing because of climate change and the acceleration of fires burning. What we have to do is find some way of slowing this down. And suppression is always going to be a big part of it. It's very necessary, but we've got to start giving fire managers and the forest industry more tools to work with, more experts to work with to understand better how can we slow this freight train before it explodes and kills people.
Right.
And I think
go ahead, Kate.
But just, I think it will take a bit of a public awareness campaign as well to know that, so actually, I think I was at one of the same CCFM meetings, and it was in Saskatchewan, and there was a large fire break built around a community, and it looked to me like a clear cut, but there was a big sign up that said, "We've taken measures to prevent wildfire in our community, and that's why you're looking at a large fire break, and we're going to maintain it," basically. And I thought, that's what the public needs to see, is this action was taken, and this is the reason why. And I think you're right. I think we've been through this often, actually, talking to the federal government, that it needs to they want to be the solutions provider. They want to cut the ribbon on something. But often what is needed is actually scaling up local solutions that are working, which is communities, provinces, First Nations, Métis communities, and in empowering them to do more. And you're right. It's counterintuitive a bit for
and let's face it, we have a bureaucracy that is risk averse in this country. Big bold strategies just don't come up the chain anymore, because people are afraid that if it doesn't work, they're gone. And I think, that's what we've got to do, is empower people within the bureaucracies as, okay, do the Houston NASA thing, is that I don't care how crazy the idea is. Let's just look at it. And I think that's what we've got to do, is embolden people in the bureaucracy that can move certain things forward. And I think, we also have to have something like, the Canadian Forest Service, which is a tiny agency, based here in Edmonton and little pockets. I mean, we've got to have maybe a forest minister again, like we had in the past, that will sit at the table, in the priority planning meetings and say, okay, fellow cabinet ministers, here's what we need to do. And,
because the pressure on this, Ed, is going to disappear as soon as the fires do.
Yeah.
The political pressure will disappear as soon as the fires do. But the price of food is still going to be high.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you need to find a way for sustained pressure from people that are really engaged, whether that's municipalities or provinces or Indigenous groups, because otherwise it's just easy in politics to forget about things that aren't burning at the moment.
Yep. I entirely agree. And that's, the catch-22 is that it's like a fire manager said. In fact, it was Cliff White, who was the architect of Parks Canada's fire management strategy, told me the other day, is that he just isn't convinced that, anything's good that's going to come out of this. He thinks it's going to take a few more cities to burn. And I would add to that, it's going to take a few more cities to burn and some people to die for the real wake-up to come to call. That just seems to be the Canadian way, is you got to push them, to the edge of the diving board, and then let go of, of their seat of the pants, and at that point, maybe we will move forward. But you're right. I mean, right now, they're happy to give out checks. You're going to see a lot of politicians coming into Jasper in the next little while. In fact, I've been asked to, be involved in sort of a recovery strategy, and I'm sure there are going to be checks that come with it, and the politicians will all be taking credit for it. But they're just not willing to sign those checks to do what's necessary to stop writing those kind of checks.
Right, Kate. Any last words before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm really hopeful. I think part of it is some kind of commitment to share information on the exposure maps of Canada. And then you have decision makers, those mayors, those community leaders saying, now I see red all in this map, which means my community is high exposure to a fire. And we need the guidance, the tools, the funding, to enable solutions. And then, provinces and the federal government need to step up. And then there's got to be a creative way that this is some kind of cost recovery, or that this becomes something. There's creative solutions out there, I think, with insurance, with avoided wildfire offset credits, whatever it might be, but some more sustainable solutions to help communities most at risk moving forward.
Excellent. So thank you both so much. This was a really fascinating conversation. You're both so knowledgeable. I learned a ton, and I bet my listeners did too. And maybe we should come back next year and see if things are any better.
Okay.
Do an update.
All right.
Yeah, we'd be happy to. Thank you for the invitation, David.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ed.
Take care of yourselves. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you Herle Burly-ites out there who watched or listened to today's show. Thanks a bunch. We'll be back next week with more of it. Take care of yourselves.